Next up in the box build is glue up, but before I glue up, I wanted to finish the top and bottom plywood pieces because I knew I was going to stain them and it'd be difficult to stain them once the box is together. I put some finish on an offcut from the side material so I'd have a sense of what it was going to look like. I made some samples here with some different stain that I had. It turned out I had to go buy a darker stain, which I did. That's this one. And ended up, I've got, I think it's ebony, and then I put a dark walnut on top of that. So it gives me a dark, slightly reddish color. And that's what it looks like. There it is next to that. So I think that's going to be fine. I'm not getting too carried away with this. So I put the two coats on a day apart, make sure they dried, and then I've got one coat of an oil varnish blend on here. Next up is the glue up. So I've put this together, and I always want to make sure that I have everything I need before I glue up. I don't want to be hunting around for parts in the middle of a glue up or clamps or cauls, whatever. So I think I'm good to go. I'm going to be using liquid hide glue because I get a little longer working time and it's a little more slippery than a typical yellow glue. And I mentioned in one of the previous videos, my joints are a little on the tight side, so I don't want them to freeze up too quickly. So I think that hide glue is going to work well. I may not need the clamps, but I want to have them ready just in case. Like I said, it goes together tightly, so I think once everything's snug, I don't think I'll need the clamps, but they're here just in case. I've got cauls ready to go. My cauls are typically 1/4 inch MDF. I cut them 1 inch wide and various lengths. So those are just, I can just set those there and put the clamps on. Clamps all fit nicely. I've got the right length clamps. I've got enough clamps. I've got a hammer here. I've got my glue. I've got a acid brush, which for box joints I think works well. To use the acid brush, typically the bristles are pretty long, so I cut them a little shorter so it's a little easier to control where the glue goes. I just set it on a block of wood, take my chisel and trim them so they're nice and short and everything's flat. So I'm going to take this apart, put some glue on the joints, and we'll put it together. Almost forgot, I need to sand the inside faces of the box first. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll go ahead and glue up. So these are pretty smooth, so I'm starting with 120, which might be a touch on the coarse side, but I'll just hit them lightly with 120 on the hard side of my blocks. I've always got a hard side and a cork side. 150, 180, I'll finish with 240. The last two, I'm using the cork side, and I should be good to go here. All right, one more thing. I almost forgot, I need to route the dados for my dividers. So I've cut the dividers roughly to size here. There's going to be 3 of them. And I measured the thickness. It's just under 1/4 inch. It turns out I have a router bit that's pretty close to that size. I measured the distance from here to here, which is the inside dimension of the box. I will then subtract off the thickness of 3 of these. That will be the distance in between each of these. Then I'm going to measure over, from here, from the outside. I'm going to route those 2 grooves up against, my fence here. And then I'll center as best I can to do the middle one. I'm going to route all the way through, even though the divider's not going to go all the way to the bottom, but it's just going to be too much trouble to stop, particularly since when I route these, I'm going to be, having a stop here. I'll route, and then to do the other side, I'll have to turn around. So it'd be a pain to, have to start in the right spot on one and stop in the right spot on the other. Not going to mess with it. I did the math, and just to get a sanity check here, I've got my three thicknesses stacked together here. I've got that lined up with my edge. Measure over here. It is really close to 9 inches. If I divide that by 4, I get 2 1/4. So I have 2 1/4 between each one, which is what I had planned for. The cards are 2 1/8. Gives me a little wiggle room, so I'm good to go. So I'll go ahead and set that up and route those. I set my combination square to 2 1/4, set it on there, made a knife line. Now remember, I want to go from here, not from here. From that little knife line, I'm hoping you can see that. It just barely shows up there. I've got that set right to the edge there. So I'll go ahead, make a pass, then I'll center it by making sure I come in from both sides to get the same measurement and make the final cut there. I've got this centered now, and I want to make sure that when I route these are going to go together like that. I want to make sure I'm coming in from the same end. Just in case it's not quite centered, at least the divider will be parallel to the edges. So I'm going to use them like that. Okay, finally ready to go here. One thing I noticed, as I was routing through these, when the bit comes out the back side, you sometimes get a little tear out there. Now I was backed up, on the outside, but I was not backed up when I went through this groove. So if I'd really planned ahead, I would have cut these dados first and then cut the groove in here. But I wasn't thinking that far ahead. So anyway, I am ready to go now, and we'll go ahead and glue up. So I'm just going to put, just a little bit of glue. It's not going to take much to get these things to stick together well. I just want to make sure all these surfaces are wet with glue. And I typically do the part that takes the longest to apply the glue. I do that part first, because then it doesn't sit as long when I put the part, or put glue on the part where that process goes quickly, if that makes sense. On this case, it doesn't really matter. I don't think one part's any easier than the other. I'm going to put a little bit of glue just on this outer part where the joint comes together. Okay, usually when I put a box together, I put one corner together first. And notice I've got this hanging over this piece here, so that because these stick out a little bit, I don't want them on top of another part. So I'll put one corner together, put the bottom in. Now I'm not gluing in the bottom. Sticking a little bit for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on there. Okay, so now make sure that's not hanging over the edge, or that it is hanging over the edge. Okay, that all looks nice and tight. I'm I may throw some clamps on just to be on the safe side. Now I want to make sure it's square. Just double checking to make sure my marks all line up. And I know from before I want to be just a touch under 16 and 7/8. So that one's a little bit on the long side. Okay, that looks really good. I'm going to double check here. Make sure. Yeah, that looks great. So now I'll go ahead and just be on the safe side. I'm going to put some clamps on here. And I'm making sure my cawls aren't interfering with the glue there. So I usually tighten up and then back off just to hold it in place. So I've got the clamps sitting on the box. That makes sure they're parallel this way. And then I'm just kind of eyeballing the other direction. Yeah, that looks fine. Okay, so I'll let that dry. I'll glue up the top and we'll see how they fit together. Okay, it's the next day. I've got both parts glued up. The glue's all dry. I wanted to show that when I glued up the top pieces, I was able to set them, once I flipped this bottom part over, I was able to set them within the cawls here. So right, the bottom's gonna, or the, these are aligned correctly. This piece goes down at the bottom, which will become the top. So I'm pretty confident everything's going to align in terms of the top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and unclamp this, and I'll start sanding the parts and probably come back when I start installing the hardware.